Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Benjamin Bolton. I'm head of Europe here at Teredu. And for those that may not be familiar with our work, Teredu is building the world's largest platform for climate learning and green skills development. And we have a bold mission to get 100 million people working in climate this decade. And this includes, upskilling employees and helping organizations bridge the green skills gap so they can kind of accelerate their sustainability transformation. So firstly, I just want to say a huge thank you to Julien for partnering with us on this event today. We're so fortunate to have you join us today and share your insights, so thank you. Before I introduce Julien and we kind of dive into the conversation, I'm excited to announce that today's event is actually the second in a new series that we've launched, which is featuring change makers within organizations who are effectively leading climate education and employee engagement initiatives as part of kind of wider sustainability integration efforts. So our intention with these events is to really build a community where we can all learn, share, and also kind of inspire each other in this work. So without further delay, let's get to the reason why we're all here. So it's my pleasure to introduce Julien Weyl. So Julien originally trained as an engineer and started making satellites and planes at Airbus. So excited to kind of hear about, a bit more about your journey there. And after several years kind of doing that work, decided that he wanted to have more positive impact, and so was inspired by work that he had done with NGOs on climate and social change, and some projects that you're engaged in there. He then decided to basically further his education by doing an MBA at London Business School. So I think we're both based here in London, and Columbia University, where he focused on tech companies working in climate and social change. And then moving from kind of VC investment to a tech startup, he co-founded not one, but two companies. Hopefully not at the same time, but yeah, interested to hear your experience with that. And then helped a tech mobility scale up via Expand here in Europe. And until recently was leading the climate agenda as head of sustainability at the tech scale up Stuart. And then, really excited to also hear about your journey following that. So without further delay, would love to maybe just say initially, welcome, Julien. Thank you so much again for partnering with us. And, there's a lot we want to cover today, but since, this is going to tee up, I think, a lot of the topics that we want to talk about, I'd love if you could kind of briefly tell us about your journey. Obviously, I've covered it at a relatively high level there, from, all the way from Airbus to Stuart. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ben, and hi, everybody. Very happy to be here with you today. So thanks a lot for inviting me, and I hope the conversation will be interesting and insightful for everybody. So yeah, I mean, you might have kind of like noted this. I started my career briefly at Airbus. At the time, I found it probably the most exciting company out there. And now looking back, I still think it's pretty good stuff and exciting things they're doing there. But of course, with the environmental lens that I have now, this was, of course, not a match anymore. And so growing through kind of like that experience about working on kind of like very deep tech and flying objects at the time, I started to realize that, that was not very much aligned with what I really wanted to do from a social and environmental impact. And of course, at the same time, kind of like the ecosystem and as a whole was starting to kind of like boil down on those specific terms. And so I started to think about what I could do at the back of that experience at Airbus, and basically decided, as you mentioned, to kind of like further a little bit my education to start to better understand the kind of like flip side of the engineering and technical world, which were things related more to business as a whole. And I have to say that was a very interesting time because I had the available amount of time to think and to start to direct my attention to topics more related to impact and technology. And so during that time, as you mentioned, I had the opportunity to do a little bit of time in impact investments and VC, but I very quickly realized that I really enjoyed more being part of the organization and delivering the impact. And so at the back of that, as you mentioned, I started a company and then another one in the impact sphere, and that was a very exciting journey, and one of those companies still running today, and I'm just kind of like overseeing it from far. But also one thing that I learned from those companies that actually I enjoyed having the impact in slightly larger organization where things were already set up, and I felt that that was a really nice place I wanted to be in once I phased out from the previous organization I built. And that's how I ended up kind of like working basically for Stuart in my latest employment. Just for context, Stuart is a last mile tech logistics platform. Basically those kind of organizations that if you use fast delivery services, basically we power this kind of organization from the logistic point of view, so the people bringing quickly the goods or the foods or whatever you need, but also from the technology platform about how we best match that supply and that demand. And maybe to kind of like complement on that, and I'm sure we're going to go back to that in a moment on Stuart, I think what was very interesting is, in my opinion, is that that's a role I created and I pitched myself to the organization. And I think when we look at, you know, what's coming out there and the different people looking for jobs, as many Terra follows are doing in that organization, of course, you have what is available on the platforms and on the websites, but you can also suggest ideas and pitch also those specific roles in the organization you're talking to. And that is something that maybe we want to discuss a bit more later.
Absolutely, and we'd love to dig into that and kind of understand a bit more about how you kind of carved out this opportunity as well. And are you able to share a little bit about your journey, you know, after Stuart as well? We'd love to hear, you know, hear about that.
Yeah, sure. So I as you mentioned, I kind of like left Stuart over the summer. It was really a good run for me. I kind of like spent about a bit more than 2.5 years there, and we're going to talk about more, but basically building that agenda and building the team and the maturity of the function to a point where I felt it was the right time for me to move on to something else. And I was really in high confidence of the team at the organization to be able to continue the great work that we started. And so, you know, the first thing I took is a bit of time for myself, which I highly recommend to everybody if you ever have the time to do that. And basically thinking about another type of organization in which I could really contribute to. And right now, I'm actually working on another project with someone else, still in the mobility space, but more around kind of like more traditional and low-emitting mode of transportation, and try to redevelop that in the European continent.
Incredible. Well, thank you for sharing that. And maybe, as you say, to kind of rewind a little bit, I'd love to, you know, learn a little bit more about your work at Stuart and kind of the commitments that you and essentially the objectives you were driving towards, and kind of what were you tasked with accomplishing? Like, maybe let's start there.
Yeah, of course. So maybe something that is quite particular that I mentioned before is this is a role, or was a role, that didn't exist. And maybe the story there was quite interesting, because I was basically talking with a person in charge at Stuart. I was kind of like introduced to someone else, and he was basically, it was during COVID time, so those kind of organizations were really booming and exploding because of people needing to actually have a lot of things delivered to them. And we had a discussion, and he's explained to me that, you know, they needed people to support in more traditional functions. And basically I was telling him, well, you know, all this looks great, and, you know, we'd be very keen to explore way of working together. But what is clear for me is that the impact and the work I'm doing and the content is becoming so important that I will not do anything else than basically a head of sustainability. But I actually told him at the back of that all the benefits that could come from it, and start to deep dive into, you know, the ideas about having something like this in the organization. And so I didn't hear from him for a couple of days, and then he called back and say, you know what, I think we would open and we'll open a role like this. If you're interested, we should try to see if that could work. And so that's kind of like how I got into the role. And to your question around the scope of achievement and what was asked, basically nothing was asked. They didn't know what they wanted. They just knew that they wanted to do something about it, and they had the ambition and the drive to actually put resources into delivering that. And so this is maybe slightly more original than, you know, the way you would generally approach kind of like a business related role in an organization. But that's how it started. And so the way we approached it with the organization was basically first really trying to, understand first what it meant for the organization, and then starting to frame the agenda and the expectation together. And in that dynamic, that was quite interesting because I was trying to push for something extremely, extremely ambitious, obviously. And I was met with, more reality of the business and tried to navigate that duality. And so in a way, we ended up in a place where we had a very ambitious agenda in terms of what we wanted to deliver, which was, aligned, of course, with the Science-Based Target Initiative and all those kind of like standards out there. But we were also trying to go forward and further in that organization, especially on the social side, to basically start to partner with more organizations in the ecosystem and really start to form those kind of coalitions that can really start to move the market much more. And I think that was kind of like the intent I was trying to push, to really go beyond the way we were normally doing sustainability a bit in isolation within the organization, but to try to kind of like extend that conversation at an ecosystem level, from kind of like suppliers to competitors to partners and clients. And that was in a way to describe maybe the ambition that we wanted to achieve in that agenda, on top of the more traditional kind of like specific metrics that, I mentioned basically by saying that we were aligning on the Science-Based Target Initiative with 2035 goals and so on and so forth.
And just for context for everyone who's, listening in today, like how large was Stuart? Like how many employees did you have at that time? Kind of what scale are you kind of operating?
Yeah, I mean, Stuart is like roughly 1,000 kind of like people organization, kind of like a couple of 100 million revenues. So, that's kind of like scale up stage. But we, of course, because we were working in the logistics space, we also had a lot of, independent workers working for us in the 10 of thousands, basically across Europe. So that's basically the size of the organization.
And did you have a team? I guess I'd kind of love to hear from you about, you had these ambitious goals, aligning with Science-Based Targets Initiative, which, the gold kind of standard really, for corporates. And how, like, what support did you have in doing that? And how much did you need the support of, others within the organization to actually meet these ambitious goals? I'm assuming that, if I'm not sure, kind of, it would be interesting to hear about your team, but I'm assuming that you wouldn't have been able to do that alone, right? So you had to engage your colleagues at scale.
Yeah, no, I think when I think back to your question and the journey, it feels very much like building a company within an organization, really, especially because the agenda was so new and everything need to be crafted. And so it was very similar basically to the journey of a startup, where initially it was trying to understand what we wanted to do, get initial, funding, and, 2 team members to kind of like try to put those things together. And then once this was kind of like much more clear in the mind of many people, then we were able to kind of like go after more internal investments, running more programs with more people. So that's kind of like how we grew. We grew to a team of about, 10 people-ish, like really fully dedicated to the topic. And then, of course, you rely on a lot of other people within the organization, from the operation teams to the technical teams, to basically deliver and contribute to the work. So that's a bit how we did it. And I'm quite aware that this size of teams can sound quite big for a sustainability area. I know a lot of people in the industry have much more restricted team compared to the size of the organization. I'm aware we are quite fortunate in that sense. But that's kind of like how we compose and grew the team, but also the investments to basically be able to deliver some of the programs we were working on.
And my assumption is that there's probably a lot of trial and error in terms of like how you actually kind of implement a lot of these initiatives. Can you kind of maybe share a bit of perspective on that? Like, what experiments did you deploy, and kind of what did you learn, what did work, what didn't work? We'd just love to hear. I'm
Yeah,
sure that evolved over the course of your journey as well, so it would be great to hear about that.
absolutely. I mean, I would love to say that was a smooth and very structured approach to trying and kind of like failing or confirming hypotheses and things like that. I think that was kind of like the intent originally, but the reality of the ground was quite different, if I'm honest. I think what I started with was a lot of I was personally very fueled by that work and really wanted to deliver the highest level of ambition possible. And I think a lot of people in the Terra community might feel in the same way, in terms of kind of like, we don't have any moment to waste. We need to accelerate the transition and do very high things, and being able to kind of like accelerate all the things. And that's what I was in a way trying to do. But I kind of like quickly realized that this was not really working, and I had to work also at a pace that were more suited to the organization. And I had to gain ally with the organization from the top management, but also, very importantly, from the middle management teams. And really starting to be much more strategic about how you approach the different people with what they care about. And I think maybe that's an interesting point, because that was a very, very key learning. I was originally very kind of like, it's an obvious way we need to reduce the emissions. Why would anyone question it? And so it's a given, and it's more about the how and not the why. And what I found is actually within a business context, people have very different incentives and focus areas. For instance, the CFO might really only look at cost and revenue, or mainly cost, when the operation team might look at efficiency and success rates, and the business teams might look at way to differentiate the offering and kind of like growth in terms of clients and revenue. And those things are very, very different. And I think what became apparent and very important is being able to address those different audiences in different way with their own language. And there's someone that I'm sure many people in this audience might know, called Catherine Hayhoe, who worked a lot about the communication on climate and how to approach this. Really recommend her book. That was really a very interesting insights that I tried to pull in to approach that specific challenge. And maybe one way to explain it in simple terms to the audience in terms of messaging, one thing that I kind of like is, if you look at the city of London, everybody agrees, that pollution is a big problem. Air pollution has an impact on health. It has an impact, on the concentration. It has an impact on many, many different things in life. And I think a lot of people would agree that we need to decrease pollution. But much less people would agree that we need to reduce emissions in London, because you might have kind of like debates around the right to drive and kind of like all the complexity that goes into the conversation. And so when thinking about that, actually what become very clear is actually the emission and the pollution, the underlying are the cars. So the underlying is exactly the same, but the message to the audience is very different. Let's fight pollution compared to let's fight emissions. And that has a material effect. And so bring that back into how we were doing things was very, very similar, really trying to speak the language of the audience from a cost perspective, from differentiation perspective, from a basically operation improvement efficiency perspective, was really, really the strongest way to gain momentum within the organization. I might have gone a little bit on a tangent here. Apologize, Ben, but I hope that...
No, not at all, not at all. And we hear this a lot. It's really important to speak the language of the stakeholder group that you're, trying to engage. And, I think the examples you provided there, illustrate that perfectly. One question I have for you, you kind of alluded to this earlier, like when sustainability ambition meets business reality, like how did you engage, for example, leadership when you had situations like that? How did you speak their language? to kind of navigate those tensions?
Yeah, clearly not easy, and there's no magical way to do it. I think it's very iterative and see what works, especially in contexts when we are not like a clear win. So, you know, the efficiency gains are always clear win for everybody. Those ones are very easy and the ones that generally people should start with. But when you start to needing investments that will maybe only repay in the long run, that's where you start to have a bit of a tension and discussion, of course. I think one thing that a couple of points maybe that answer this question. The first one are the importance of quick wins. Those efficiency gains, for instance, those ones are relatively easy to sell. Let's communicate about them so people see the value that, for instance, the sustainability organization or the investment in those kind of programs can bring. It creates the trust that is so needed for departments that sometimes are a bit hidden in the organization or not very well known or acknowledged by the rest of the entity. So the quick win are very, very important. The other one is, of course, the internal marketing, being able to be heard, voiced, and sharing that type of information across. Sorry, there's a lot of changes on the screen, so I'm going to be distracted. Across the space. So the quick win, the marketing, and also being able to have I think it's important to be really no bullshit and having the real trade-offs laid out for people. And being clear and honest about sometimes we win and sometimes we might lose in the short term, and being able to have the conversation with the exco, for instance, and being able to create that trust that, you know, I'm also looking for insights from them about how to address that specific problem that we identified, is a way to gain momentum and buy-in from those decision makers. So yes, the quick win and the way you communicate, bringing in to the conversation the people deciding, so they feel more owners about the problem and the solutions to be given, might be the three kind of like points I would allude to now.
And what about the role of education in terms of like how you engage colleagues, both from a kind of top-down perspective, bottom up? Would love to hear, you know, how you approach that.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the question. I think that's exactly the kind of like the underlying element that is really so important, because people can only really contribute and understand what we're doing, even the wins on the communication, the conversation with the exco, only if they have the ground understanding about what's going on. And so absolutely the education is extremely important. And specifically the education, which is not just related to the company, but also to the individual as citizens. And I think that's important when we think about the role of an organization in the broader ecosystem of a city, of a country. Because people working in that organization are not just employees, they are citizens, they are husbands, they are mothers, they are friends, and being able to empower them to do things, of course, within the organization, but outside is so important. And an employer has the ability to support that training and that understanding for the employee, but also for the husband, for the mother, and so on and so forth. And I think that is very, very important. And actually, we tried our part to do something in this, to kind of like really empower the entire organization with the right level of information and knowledge to be able to address the problem.
And really, I mean, so much of this strikes me as you're kind of creating a common language around these issues. And could you maybe talk a little bit about, you know, in a 1,000-person company, how did you do that? Like you mentioned you tried a few things. I know of one intervention that you made. Perhaps you could share a little bit more about how you approached kind of creating that common language and kind of baseline understanding, let's say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's maybe two elements to it, especially in an organization which is quite technical or kind of like that word of the scale-up world. Data is very important, and data is driving a lot of the decisions. And so one element was the language of data, and the other one was, of course, the language of climate and sustainability and what was happening there. And so maybe on the first one, on the data side, what was very important is, of course, first understanding the data very well for us and the team, and then being able to communicate those data and provide the visibility of those data. For instance, implementing emission data within most of the dashboards that people are using, surfacing data that are important in terms of emission or social welfare into kind of like boards discussions, and basically really having people to understand the impact on the emission within the data framework and structure they're using was a very important element, especially when talking with the more technical engineer-minded people that really care about the data and what's the underlyings look like. So that was really important and not that easy to do, to be honest. On the other side, on the more like broader, let's say, education, language, on the climate side, what we did is we worked with an NGO called the Climate Fresk. I'm sure some of you might know them, and if you don't know them, I really encourage you to do one of their free workshops online. They basically a 3 hours workshop to try to unpack the cause and the consequences of climate change and having a space to actually talk about it emotionally and into actions. And so what we decided to do is actually train about 30 people within the organization to facilitate those kind of workshops. And then we had one big day where everybody in the organization had basically Climate Fresk delivered to them by their colleagues. That was quite a challenge, to be honest, and we managed to basically train about 500 people in one day. So that was already quite significant, and then we trained the people later down the line, of course. But it was really significant because people really remembered that day. It was kind of like a big bang and sparked a lot of the conversation within the organization and helped bringing the agenda from kind of like the bottom or like a kind of like a gray zone to really a top of the mind kind of like topic. And we went further and then kept that workshop for every new employees we had and for many kind of like meetings we had. And I think talking to the common language, that really helped everybody better understand the problems we're in and helped a lot of the people buy in some of the decisions we had to make and some of the trade-offs that were in front of us that basically relied on a common understanding about what the problem was. So that's kind of like a concrete way about how we approach that initial education. And then, of course, we follow up with sometimes more deeper ways of engaging on the topic. We opened the facilitation to people. We created kind of like days for communities where people could actually train some of their people in their community through the Climate Fresk or doing other kind of like activities of the sort.
Incredible. And I love the fact that you say you started with this big bang and you trained 500 people and then just kind of it became almost part of your onboarding for newer employees. So in past conversations, you've referred to creating a pressure cooker around sustainability. And I'd love maybe if you could just share a little bit more about your philosophy and kind of specific, what you mean specifically by that term. We can kind of dig into that.
I don't know if I would put that pressure cooker image as a philosophy. I think that's not, but I kind of like love cooking, so that's kind of like the image I used, and this is an image I use to try to see how we can accelerate the impact we're going to have on the emission reduction, for instance, because we all know kind of like what direction we are going. A lot of companies, more and more companies are getting involved, start to have plans, but really the hard thing is to be able to deliver on the plans that we all know needs to be delivered and how quickly we can do that. And the idea of the pressure cooker is basically to cook faster your boiling potatoes than if you didn't have that pressure within. And that's really the same thing. And the way I think about it is really the wall of the pressure cooker, the bottom and the top. So it's really trying to engage everybody at the bottom of the pyramid of your kind of like employees, all the middle management around and the top management and shareholder. And not just one, but really all of them, specifically the middle management. And I think that is very interesting because when you start to engage and create those demand that comes from the bottom to the top, then you start to understand that pressure mounting. So if you have one, employee in a team starting to challenge their manager about why don't we do more of that, or I have an idea about how to address that emission reduction, should we work on it? That is starting to get the conversation going within that team. And when people are kind of like started to ask their managers, why don't we do more? That manager will ask their manager about what's going on within their team and ask why don't we do more? What's going on there? And that starts to create that pressure. And those those sounds that the top management might hear actually are very, very important, because when we bring the topic on the table in the board or any type of occasion, then the topics are already there in their minds, and they already hear them, and they know they need to address them because people are asking questions. And that really helps to move the agenda faster. And I think that's a bit the strategy that a lot of the sustainability people in organization have, is how do I deliver on my plans faster? Because we know how to measure, we know what needs to be done. The hardest part is really getting it done.
So maybe you can talk to some of the challenges you faced when you're trying to kind of scale these initiatives, when you're trying to engage your employees at every level within the organization. You've alluded to, or express the importance of particularly that middle management layer. What challenges did you encounter, and how did you overcome them?
So a couple of, I think one challenge is the alignment. Clearly, the alignment of the middle management of all the organization towards the goal we're trying to do. A middle manager might, in the operation team, might only care about the success rate in some form or way. And so the moment you add an objective to it, let's say emission reduction, it basically makes its life harder, because now they have to do two things and not just one. And they don't really know how the things are connected and how to navigate that. And so you can be really met with resistance there, because you're making someone else's job harder. And that is kind of like a difficult place to be, and you don't really want to be in that place. Even if the people are really willing, at the end of the day, they will make the decision based on what their boss expects them to do, which is the first objective, the efficiency or the success rate, and not the emission reduction. And so that's, I found what was really a tricky place to be. And so the learning that came out of it was really to try to leverage the existing organizational structures that you have in your organization. At Stuart, we're using traditional OKRs methodology, objective and key results. So you have these kind of like high-level objectives. Then you have a couple of key results, for instance, cost reduction, success rate, and a couple of others. And basically, one of the first and most important fights I had was to try to bring a sustainability metric in those OKRs. Because the moment you have them within the existing organizational structure, it will trickle down the organization naturally, and everybody will be aligned in the remuneration and the objectives along those key results that the organization has set. And so by really looking at delivering and adding a key result within the existing key result of the organization, you will benefit from all the structure already in place. And that is extremely powerful and impactful in terms of acceleration. So I think that alignment piece was very difficult, but that's kind of like one that is really, really helping to deliver that acceleration. I think another piece that might be a challenge is the kind of, I would call it the kind of like bullshit vibe. So we know very well that for companies communicating outside about their sustainability agenda, there's a lot of actual bullshit out there, but also there's a lot of truth, but also we always need to turn it so it looks good for the companies. And how do you navigate that? And there's 1,000 words that explains different way you can approach that, but it's always kind of like difficult. The good thing when you're like talking to your internal audience, you can be much more clear in terms of your language and explain the reality of the things and how they are. And I think that is something that is not easy, because most of the marketing department, also you in your own incentive, it's much better to say we're doing only amazing things working well and not really talking about the hard things or the trade-off. And that was kind of like a big challenge, to have a very honest conversation about the problem and what we can do and what we cannot do. And so I think that was another challenge as a job. And maybe if I can close on that about a last challenge, which is more personal, and I'm sure if there's anyone doing that type of job within the organization that might understand what I mean, is the frustration that you might have as a sustainability leader, because you're facing those two challenges, and then you always need to come with tactics, ways, and approaches to actually deliver on that, but it's never fast enough compared to what you expect the results to be. And that is something you really need to learn how to manage personally, so you can do a good job and you can be extremely positive in your communication and real in the challenges you're facing. So that's kind of like maybe the 3 points in terms of challenges: 2 from the organization, the alignment of the organization, and the second point, and kind of like the frustration bit and managing that personally for your own mental health, very important as well.
It's so interesting you mentioned that last point, because we work with lots of sustainability leaders within organizations, and they share this same sentiment. And I think it's hard work driving this change within organizations, and there is some tension there in terms of the pace at which you would like things to change, and the reality of kind of this sustainability integration, if you will. Maybe kind of following up on that, like, how did the initiatives and your efforts affect the overall culture at Stuart? And were there kind of signs that demonstrated that climate had kind of, and sustainability, become part of the DNA?
Yeah, I mean, totally. I think a couple of points as well on this question. Maybe the first one is the organizational setup of the sustainability agenda. So on this one, for instance, before it was kind of like spread across geography with regional management and very little kind of like central oversight. And we managed to grow from that regional view to a much more central, consolidated approach. And so, the way the sustainability team sits is very important. And now it sits under strategy, which, is actually a really, really big deal in itself, because it understands everything around where the organization wants to go, kind of like the main challenges that the organization is facing, and can build within those strategies. And it's not just an adjacent strategy, it can be built within the other type of strategy. And I think that is a really nice place, for instance, for the sustainability team to be. So on an organization side, clearly kind of like a big win in terms of how we develop. Another one can be linked to the budget allocated and the number of people working on it full time. It's also a demonstration. Again, when I joined, there were nobody and there were no budget. And then you end up kind of like with a couple of people, a couple of millions and kind of like on the table to deliver on the agendas, and very robust programs and partners. And so that in itself is a testament about the company delivering and wanting to deliver on that objectives. And of course, kind of like one obvious one is the actual impact you have, right? And kind of like celebrating. For us, one of the big program was supporting our couriers partners to transition to low emitting vehicle. And so supporting that financially, finding the right partners, and helping on that journey. And when you start to see the numbers of those transitions happen, and they're very happy, they have a better lifestyle, they have a lower cost of running it, it's more reliable, a lot of benefits. Basically, you kind of like see what is actually happening. And when you start to count those numbers in larger and larger and larger terms, you get really excited, because you get that momentum and that kind of like hockey stick type of curve, which is really exciting.
And I'm sure, the more your colleagues could see that impact, the more they could kind of really get behind and understand kind of the change you were trying to drive. So it kind of becomes almost cumulative. So maybe switching gears a little bit. So we hear a lot about the green skills gap, and I'd love to hear, what did that kind of challenge mean for you at Stuart? In view of trying to achieve ambitious science-based targets. We talked a little bit about having this common language, but how important is making sure that essentially your teams have the skills they need, that you have the right talent on board to actually drive your sustainability strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that needs to be acknowledged, and I think Tara does it very, explained very well, is every job is a climate job, and that's really true, because the way I approach, or I see the climate challenges often, and you have specific climate jobs, like being a climate scientist is a climate job in itself. But being an operation executive in a last mile delivery company maybe is or maybe is not a climate job. And the way I generally think about it is more the lenses you put on and how you see the world and how you see the job. So in that sense, really anyone in any type of capacity within the organization has a lot of power in putting on their green glasses instead of putting on maybe their cost reduction glasses or their efficiency gaining glasses, but their emission reduction glasses, and seeing through their reality and through what they control, how can they contribute to that agenda? And that's kind of like how I generally see it in organizations that are maybe not working directly on climate, that have a huge contribution in terms of emission globally. And so in that sense, everybody really can see things through those green lenses. And I think we need to first understand that people have that kind of power. Now to kind of like the skill gap and kind of like the additional elements that people need to get to be able to deliver on that, I think there's a couple of them. First, the understanding that you can do. And secondly, of course, the common language we talked about, being able to understand and deliver on that green vision, understanding what emissions are, what different type of emissions are, the links between emission data and operation data. So there's an element around data, which is quite important there. The systemic elements, how things are connected. I think that's also very, very interesting in terms of skill set, and understanding how nature works and how everything is connected is basically a very good example at your own scale about understanding how those things are connected with the kind of like climate goals you're trying to achieve. And also I think one very important thing is the language of the climate world, right? Right now, through all the kind of like traditional media, we hear a lot of noise around very different type of terminology, which can be very, very confusing. And being able to understand this type of language and understand what they mean is extremely powerful in taking action, because sometimes people would go away from that because it's too complicated, it's a bit like specific, and it's quite hard to understand. And so that's also an element that is quite important, from kind of like the data and the empowerment and the green glasses analogy, from the kind of the 2 points I'm making. I'm just kind of like losing my train of thoughts here, but basically those kind of like key elements that I mentioned.
Well, I really love the green glasses analogy. I think that's brilliant. I'd love to, so I've got a couple of questions, and then we'd love to open up for audience Q&A, because I'm sure we've got some questions from our participants today. But before we get to that, I would love to hear, what advice do you have for other sustainability leaders, practitioners who are working in similar roles to yourself, or maybe even are kind of where you were right at the beginning at Stuart, where they want to create that opportunity for themselves, and they want to scale. They want the organization to move faster, and they want to kind of scale these kinds of climate education, employee engagement type initiatives within their respective organizations.
I think first point I would say is accept the reality. And I think that's very hard, because we tend to be very optimistic in that sphere. we really want to go fast and things, but there's a lot of hurdles and there's a lot of reality that we need to understand. And not understanding them well will basically make you less successful. And think really understanding the reality of the organization you are in, the way decisions are made, the maturity of the audience in terms of the message you can provide. This is extremely important. And I think that it should not be underestimated about understanding where you are and what the reality is. Second element is build support internally with people that care about it, and kind of like internal ally, but also externally. And that's where the work of Terra and other type of organization in terms of bringing that community together is so important. And what is fascinating, I think, with any type of climate community is that people are extremely collaborative. There's no competition. We all want to succeed there. And the level of engagement and willingness to share and support each other is very, very high. So I would highly recommend to kind of like try to get into those kind of communities and talk to people and being able to exchange, not just about getting insights about people, but also sometimes just venting frustrations to people that understand your pain is important. So yeah, I think those kind of like two things are very, very important. Then of course, to deliver on the job, I think that's the kind of things that are more widely available out there. You know, how you approach it, you try to understand the reality, where the biggest emissions factors are, and really measuring and getting the data structured properly, and then start to build a couple of your programs and try to deliver on those ones. Initially the quick win, then maybe the harder one, and try to build on this as you move along.
I love that you touched on community there, and as a kind of constructive outlet for some of those natural frustrations that can come with this work. And I've got a potential solution to offer there, which I'll come back to later. Maybe just a final question from me. So looking ahead, obviously you've left Stuart now. I'd love to hear, what are your hopes for the future, and how do you see this kind of, like engagement of employees within organizations contributing to that vision?
That's a big one. I think, in terms of kind of like big wishes, of course, I wish we could deliver on the targets we set as a society, and then, people can be, going through that in a fair and just way, and, those very big things. But I think maybe what you're asking is things which are a bit more concrete or insightful for the audience. Maybe kind of like the first one would be for companies to move from measurement to action. I see a lot of companies, they know exactly where the big emissions parts are and things, but they still want to get that exact number to the comma and to the exact kind of like precisions and putting data thing. This is very important, but I can see that very often that's an excuse for not acting and doing the hard thing. And so I would really wish that maybe right now measuring and data is 80 and 20, the actions. I really wish we can go back to kind of like inverting that and saying, okay, if we get the numbers roughly right in terms of what needs to be done, not in terms of reporting, of course, it means that we know where we need to act, and let's act now. So that would be one wish, is like moving away from that just measurement and really doing and acting, because that's a hard bit, and that's really what we need. Another thing is, being able to be just and fair in what we do. Sometimes it can be easy within business and organization to not think too much about that concept of fairness and justice in the transition. But I think that's very, very important for us when we were helping couriers to transition to low-emitting vehicle. That concept about fairness and just was very important, because they cannot suffer the green premium that they have to basically buy a new vehicle, for instance. And so how can we really make that transition as fair as possible and just is, I think, very, very important in any type of transitions you're trying to make. So I wish that could be more central to the conversation as well.
Thank you. And I'm so glad you brought up, justice and equity there. what a poignant kind of point to close on. But we're now going to open up to questions from the audience. So if anyone has a question that they'd like to ask Julien, please do feel free to add it to the Q&A box. I see we've got a couple here already. So first question was, what's the name of the book by Catherine Hayhoe that you referred to? We can post a link in the chat if not.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if you type her name, you'll get it very quickly.
So look, the second question, whilst we can, I'm sure Ian can grab that and post it in the chat. What sustainability metric or objective did you manage to get these added to the company, or sorry, did you manage to get added to the company OKRs? Would you choose that same objective or a different one if you had the opportunity to do that again today?
So
great question.
Initially I wanted to really have two sets of key results, one around the environment and one around the social things. And so that's kind of like what I went with. What I had to settle with was one around the environment and a social one that was baked into another one. And so we had the environmental one was an emission reduction of X% for the metrics we are using, which was emission per kilometer, an emission per delivery, sorry. And then the social side was baked into financial elements because it was linked to pay.
Thanks so much. Thank you for adding that. I think one of the related kind of topics for me on this is like incentivization. I think having people kind of have OKRs that they're accountable to, that as you say are aligned with their other objectives is really important. So thank you, Martina, for that great question.
To that, Ben, like I think to the no bullshit point before, you will always have a few KRs. And the reality is like there's always KRs which are more important than others. And I think that's something to also be real about, is that sometimes you will have like, directly competing KRs, and then you need to live with the reality of kind of like how to balance those things. Hence the point I was making before about being able to have the space and the ground knowledge to have the conversation. Because that can happen even if you have the right KR in place. Sometimes you need to have decisions which are maybe conflicting.
Thank you for adding that. So whilst we may have some other questions from LinkedIn, but whilst Ian kind of brings those in, if we do have those, I want to take this opportunity to also share a little bit about, we talked about frustration, and actually one of the things that I hear a lot or sense a lot with the practitioners that we work with within organizations is, this can be quite lonely work sometimes. I think you alluded to that towards the end around community, the importance of community. Obviously, we're a community, and I think one of the things that we are really excited about and interested in doing more is how can we foster more community amongst kind of practitioners that are doing this work within organizations? Because I think everything you said really like highlighted the need for that. And so we're really excited to be launching or experimenting with a new format, which we're going to be launching right at the beginning of next year. And Julien, also invitation for you to be a part of that as well, that we're calling the Climate Transformation Lab. So I'm just going to put a link in the chat now. So this is something that we're hosting that is essentially bringing together leaders within organizations that are driving corporate sustainability transformation to basically support each other, to have that community, to have a safe space where they can talk about their challenges and also help each other kind of solve those. So some of the events that we're going to be running kind of under this umbrella will be kind of more oriented towards networking. Others might be more confidential and more kind of roundtables where people can have honest conversations about some of the challenges they're facing and kind of get some other perspectives. And we ran an event similar to this a few weeks ago in London. And one thing that really struck me was just how many shared challenges there are, and actually the value of kind of creating this community for kind of sustainability leaders within organizations. So yeah, really excited to kind of dig into that. And yeah, invite everyone kind of listening to this to sign up, because we have a limited number of spots that we're going to be making available for that. So that's on January the 10th. So with that, I believe we don't have any more questions. So I just wanted to extend, a heartfelt thank you to you, Julien, for sharing your insights and experiences with us. Oh wait, we've actually got one question here. Sorry, before I get to that. So Julien, do you recommend taking different approaches to scaling sustainability based on the regional culture? For example, as a US company versus a European company? And that's from Toby.
Yeah, I mean, very, very good question. I think it's to the point of the audience. And so, of course, there are cultural differences depending on the region of the world in terms of how you approach the message, the understanding of the audience, and what they care about. And so I think it's very important to curate the message towards that understanding, especially if you're talking about the US and maybe continental Europe, the kind of like approach to social welfare and kind of like how we value that, it can be quite different. And I think it's important to acknowledge that maybe a message in the US, depending on the organization, around, efficiency, cost or revenue, or kind of like financial might actually be quite strong, and maybe a message around things which are a bit more socially related in France or Germany might also catch the audience quite well. And so I think the kind of like art of how you approach that conversation with the different regions is very, very important. And spending time on understanding your audience, like any kind of basically talk, is extremely important. And curate your key points and your messages towards that audience as much as you can will just increase the probability of having an accelerated success there.
Brilliant. And thanks for that question, Toby. So yeah, Julien, thank you so much for sharing your journey, your expertise with us. Yeah, I think you've given us a lot to reflect and hopefully act on as well. So for that, we're really grateful. So thank you. And also just wanted to thank everyone who's dialed in. We've also been streaming this on LinkedIn. So thank you to those of you that have kind of are viewing this via LinkedIn. And we really believe that your participation and engagement in these events is essential to kind of helping us drive, real and kind of sustained change within organizations and the world at large. So as a reminder, today's session is the second event in a new series, or relatively recent series, that we've launched, which is essentially featuring change makers within organizations who are leading, sustainability integration, employee engagement type initiatives. And we're going to be continuing this series. We've got lots of really incredible speakers coming up, so stay tuned. I also want to give a shout out to an event we're running on Monday with Seth Hamid of Altruistic, where we're going to be doing a bit of a wrap up for the year. And he's just come back from COP28, so we're excited to kind of to get his perspective on kind of what he's seen there and some of the shifts he's seen within the kind of corporate sustainability world as well. So do stay tuned for that. And thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much, Julien, for your time. It's been such a pleasure connecting, and look forward to staying in touch. And hopefully you'll join our Climate Transformation Lab event on January the 10th.
Would be. Thank you so much, everybody. And thanks a lot, Ben and the Terra team for inviting me.